Good afternoon, everyone. Gonna take things slow, let people trickle on in. I know we're running a little bit late, which can make me feel like I'm gonna rush, but I'm gonna breathe and get ready for our training here today, which you all are gonna be very happy to experience because it is on an incredibly important topic. And whether you're someone who is new to human trafficking representation in the world of survivors, or someone who's done this for a very long time, I think we can all agree there's just never enough training opportunities. There's always more we can learn, always more that we can remember. So thank you, old and new, for joining us today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Alexis Alvarez, and I'm the Director of Statewide Training at Florida Legal Services. For those of you who have been to our trainings in the past, welcome back. For anybody new, welcome today. Those of you who are registered must know that this is Human Trafficking Awareness Month. And typically in our statewide training initiative, as you know, we try to create series around these important topics as they come up on our calendar year, but also throughout the entire year. So this is a training that we have dedicated to the topic of human trafficking rights and survivorship and advocacy on behalf of this marginalized and vulnerable population. So thank you for those of you who work in this sphere. And thank you for those who are jumping into learning about the sphere. And as always, thank you just to all of you in the legal aid community for what you do. So welcome to Prosecutorial Perspectives, training for recognizing, protecting, and supporting human trafficking survivors. And I'm super excited about this training, of course, not just because of the subject, but it's so cool. We actually have a prosecutor coming to us to talk to us about their perspectives in this world and in this sphere. And too often, legal aid does one aspect of the work and the state does one aspect of the work, and too often we feel very separated. So this is a chance to learn how we can collaboratively come together to holistically represent survivors and give the best that we can to our survivor clients. So enough from me. I talk a lot when I'm very excited about a particular training. I'll move into the housekeeping, which is the boring stuff, then go into the introduction of our speaker here today, and then we'll move right into the content. So first and foremost, this is being recorded. Our speaker has graciously and generally offered to allow us to record. That way you can go back, and I know you're going to want to. You're going to want to go back and listen to this content over and over again. So you will get a copy of this recording after the session concludes. And that recording will also come with a copy, with the CLE code. That's housekeeping announcement number 2. As you know, I'm always trying to work with you all to make sure you get your CLE credits, stay on top of that professionalism, and this was awarded CLE credit through the Florida Bar. That code will be announced at the end of the session, but like I said, will also come to your inbox along with the recording. Third piece of housekeeping announcements, questions and answers. Please, drop your questions into the chat or the Q&A. We're going to do our best to answer those questions live as they come up. So if you pop it in the chat, I'll present it to our speaker, who, within the context of time, will give you that answer. So don't be shy. You know what I always say, the virtual vortex sucks. It sucks to feel separated and not be able to communicate. So don't be shy. Put your questions in. You are a part of this. I think that's the main housekeeping announcement line up. Closed captions are on. That's always important. Anybody who needs that extra accessibility. And if the closed captions aren't sufficient enough for you, please email me. I'm going to drop my email into the chat. I will do anything, as you know, to assist you in access to our information, our knowledge, and our trainings. So with that being said, I'm going to move into the introductions of the speaker that we have here today. And with us, we have Ryan Whitaker, who was born and raised in Central Florida. She obtained her bachelor's degree from the University of Central Florida and her Juris Doctor from Florida A&M University College of Law. Ryan began her career as a prosecutor at the State Attorney's Office for the 17th Judicial Circuit of Florida in Volusia County. After taking a short break to practice criminal defense and family law, Ryan ultimately followed her passion and returned to prosecution in 2018 as an assistant state attorney at the State Attorney's Office for the 9th Judicial Circuit of Florida in Orange County. During her tenure as a prosecutor, Ryan has handled a variety of cases and developed a specialization in working with special victims of violent crimes. She currently handles all of her office's human trafficking cases and has previously prosecuted sex crimes, domestic violence, and child abuse cases. So I wasn't kidding. We have the expert. And with that being said, Ryan, thank you so much for all you do for the survivor community just on a regular basis, and your extensive history and in providing a voice to people who have suffered through what they've suffered through in this sphere. And thank you for speaking with us today and teaching us what you know. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here with you all almost at the tail end here of Human Trafficking Awareness Month. I have prepared sort of a little bit of an overview of what it is that I do compared to what it is that you do, in the hopes that it will bridge some gaps, make the process overall easier for survivors, and also give you, as a legal practitioner, some frame of reference of what your expectations are when you are working with your clients who are survivors of human trafficking. All right, so jumping right on in to the topics that we're going to cover. One of the most important things is using a victim-centered, trauma-informed approach. We're going to talk about finding evidence to support trafficking, what to do when victims or survivors want to report to law enforcement, and what to do when they don't want to report. We're also going to talk about what happens when victims / survivors are being prosecuted. So one of the most important things that we do as lawyers and people who use words and use terminology to deal with clients, to deal with victims, is to consider the words that we're using. I will use the word victim or survivor interchangeably, but one thing that I've noticed in my work is that many times a victim of human trafficking does not see themselves as a victim, whether that be because they don't know that a crime was committed against them, because there's shame or fear around associating themselves with the word victim. And then other times somebody says, I'm not a victim, I'm a survivor, I've come through this, and they don't identify with the term victim. So it's important for us to honor and respect where they are in their journey of healing and call them what they are. And there are times when I have to refer to a victim in court who doesn't see themselves as a victim, and I make sure to preface it with, hey, you're going to hear me call you a victim, and I'm calling you that because that's the legal definition of your status here today in this courtroom, and I want you to be aware of that. It's not to label you or to make you feel some type of way, but I have a job to do, and that's why I'm using that word. I use the word survivor as much as I possibly can when talking about people who've come through this, but oftentimes when somebody's in the trenches, it doesn't really matter what you call them, as long as you're calling them as they see themselves and pushing them to be a better version. Another big sort of issue is the use of the word prostitute, which as a prosecutor, prostitution is a criminal charge. That's the legal definition of it, but it's often very dismissive to call somebody who is forced to do sex work a prostitute. It is something that has a very negative connotation. And so when we're talking about, okay, well, when you were a prostitute, there's different ways that we can frame that, when you were having sex for money, or, coming up with some other way to talk to them without labeling them as a prostitute. It can go a long way in sort of giving them an opportunity to see themselves in a positive light. And legal terms, that's a big thing. I had a recently recovered victim tell me very recently, like, coercion, what is that? I wasn't coerced. I never said that. And I had to explain to them that all of the things that they have shared with us as part of their story, it goes towards the legal definition of coercion. But as a lawyer, it's my responsibility to tell the judge the legal definition of things and use facts to support that. So if I'm making a legal conclusion, I'm not putting words in their mouth, I'm using legal terms. And sometimes it's important, especially when somebody's newly out of the life, to not make them feel like you yourself are putting words in their mouth, because that's what they've been dealing with over the last however many years that they've been in this situation in the first place. The way that we question, your clients, my victims, survivors, it's incredibly important that we're cognizant of the ramifications of questioning them. We have jobs to do. We have to get to the source of what happened to them. We need to know the whole story. And there are, specific things that we can do to make that process easier. And the number one thing that I will say is don't have them continue to repeat the story. And this is something law enforcement's trained on, prosecutors are trained on. They're going to have to tell their story X number of times from beginning to end just because of what the allegations are. But things that we can do when we're dealing with them is, sit down with them one time and ask questions, listen to the story beginning to end, have one attorney assigned to that person, maybe one paralegal, or however your office is set up, and don't have it be a room full of people. Don't have it be interns who are changing in and out. Don't have it be somebody pre-screening this person for you. If you're going to be the attorney handling the case, you should be there for that initial intake where you're sitting there and you're hearing everything that happened to them. It's extremely traumatic to have to repeat the story over and over and over again. And if you're not coming from some base of understanding of everything that they said, you're going to be behind when it comes to advocating for them. Especially, I've noticed that a lot of the times people feel like, well, if I told one person this detail, they must have told this person. And they leave things out as they tell the story on and on. So take good notes. If you can record it, record it. Listen. That's the most important thing. Listen and minimize the trauma to them. Another fact that is when we're talking about their story, and we've talked about the legal terms and how confusing that can be, is be mindful of how you phrase questions. It's very easy to, ask a survivor and say, hey, what did this person, when did they force you to do this? How did they force you to do that? But that's not how you're going to get the information that you want. Oftentimes there's going to be a little bit of a pushback. Well, I wasn't forced. Because when people think forced, they think the movie Taken, and the process of them being victimized isn't the same thing as, necessarily physical force. You're going to have victims who do say, they beat me, they did this, they took that. But oftentimes there's a lot of psychological manipulation that goes into it. So one of my strategies that I use is, when somebody's telling me what happened and telling me the things that they were doing, I'll ask, well, what would happen if you didn't do that? Or what would you think would happen if you didn't do that? Did they ever, say something? Did they ever do something? And ask more about people's actions, their words, and things that somebody can actually, on a lower level, be able to do it. Not make the legal conclusion of, oh, this person did X, Y, and Z and forced me to do this, because oftentimes they don't identify with the legal terms. And that's the same, especially with coercion, with the legal definition that we have. There's so many factors that go into it. And to effectively advocate for your client, you're going to have to dig deep to get facts that support the legal conclusions. And it's going to be up to you to fill in those blanks, because your client, especially if they're newly out of the life, they haven't done all of the therapy, they haven't done all of the recovery, they're not going to be able to get there for you. And so it's important that we don't put that on them and make them feel like, oh, well, if he didn't force me, or if I say he forced me, that's not accurate. Just ask facts, ask simple questions, meet them where they are. And then another thing is find out about the negatives, which is a lot of what we're doing, but also find out about the positives. Human trafficking is a power and control mechanism. There are, if you did this, what would you get? So, if you did have sex with this person in exchange for money, what was your reward for that? Oftentimes, it's not just about the bad things that would happen to somebody if they didn't do what the trafficker wanted. Oftentimes, it's about what would happen if they did do. They would get that side of them that they had seen early on. Maybe they would get, a meal. Maybe they would get drugs. Maybe they would get, some sort of love or nourishment that they were missing. So when you're questioning them, question them about the positives as well as the negatives, because I think the negatives balance out what we're looking for. But the positives really bring it home and give you a complete picture of the psychological manipulation and the power and control. Another tactic or approach when we're talking with survivors is to mirror their language. Oftentimes we go in with the preconceived notion of what something is, or maybe you work with a lot of survivors who've had a lot of different experiences. But one thing that I think is important to do early on, especially in your first meeting, is to just write down the words that they're using to describe their situation. You know, are they describing themselves as a victim? Are they describing themselves as a survivor? Are they using some other word to describe themselves? Are they describing themselves as an ex? Is it their ex-boyfriend? Whatever they're self-identifying as, write it down and continue to use and honor that language. And how they describe the activity. You know, prostitution is, you know, sort of the no-no word that we kind of talked about, but there are words that are being used to describe these activities. They might describe it, you know, having a date with a client. They might call it having a date with a John. They might call it setting up a play. There are so many words that are used to describe the activities that allow your survivor to describe it in their own words and mirror that language. If you don't know what something is, just go ahead and ask them. Have them explain it to you one time, write it down, learn what it is. They don't expect you to know everything about, you know, their lifestyle or the things that they've done, especially when they come to you for help. But they also don't expect you to pretend that you know and then use something else later that makes them uncomfortable. And so also what they call the trafficker, you know, I like calling them the defendant because they're charged with the crime. But that's just my preference. But you know, if I have a survivor who calls them by their first name, or you know, a nickname or something else that like it gives some sort of level of, hey, this is the same person that we're talking about, I will call their trafficker that. If they don't see them as their trafficker yet, because it is often a process, you know, from the time somebody's recovered to the time that somebody's fully healed can be never, it can be years, it can be a long process. So as that process evolves, I'm going to go ahead and call them whatever, however the survivor refers to them, that's how I'm going to call them when we're talking about it. And I'm doing all of these things to kind of create a safe space for them to talk about it. When I'm mirroring their language, I'm not casting judgment on, you know, the things that they've done or the things that have happened to them. And when we're talking about a victim-centered, trauma-informed approach, I think that's the biggest one. There's going to be surprises. There's going to be negative facts. There's going to be things that we hear that we did not want to hear. And we're going to be sitting in a room with somebody that it happened to. So sometimes there's a human element of it where you feel bad, you feel a certain way. But the most important thing is to not overreact to anything. You can show compassion, but you don't have to sympathize. You don't have to, you know, pity them. Like sympathy is one thing, but pity is another. And people who are surviving and coming out of the life are often very in tune with somebody else's emotions and reactions just because of dealing with a trafficker and having to see what the trafficker's response is going to be. And they're often this emotional turmoil. So being cool, calm, and collected without judgment, just talking to them the way that they're talking to you to describe things. And that's not to say you have to use slang or talk a certain way. It's just the words that you use. If they're saying, okay, I'm doing plays, and I'm asking them questions, you know, about how many plays a day would you say you did? And then we all know we're talking about the same thing. I don't have to say how many times did you have sex with a man in a day for money, just to make my point. We can take a step back and use shared language to make sure that we're all coming across from, you know, sort of the same angle and getting the information that we all need. And this kind of goes to the point of how human trafficking actually happens. And I think that there's often a notion, and I'm sure most of us here know better, but I think until you've worked with a few victims who've been in the life, who've had this happen to them, you don't really realize exactly what human trafficking is, because it's more than just one thing. And usually it starts back when the trafficker identifies a vulnerable individual. So that first time that your victim met the trafficker, that's the start of it. It wasn't just something that was cooked up overnight. It wasn't just, you know, something that happened, but that first time they identified that they were vulnerable and in a position to be trafficked, that's kind of when human trafficking starts. There's a grooming period, the period where the trafficker is using different tactics to get information about the victim. They find out what their weaknesses are. They find out, those things about them that they need, those holes in their heart that they need filled. And then they start, playing into it, playing into it, playing into it. Eventually, once this person is, identified and groomed, it starts to be sort of this like blurred lines of boundaries. So maybe this isn't something this person would have done under different circumstances, but at this time, it kind of, the lines are blurred and it seems appropriate. And at that point, they're recruited into it. The trafficker tests them and does different things in order to, lure them into this treatment. And then once they're there, once the lines are all crossed, the force, the fraud, and the coercion, and all of those things that we actually need to prove the human trafficking, that's when those things start happening. And it's way before that, though, when your evidence of exactly what happened to your victim starts. So by the time you get to, number 4, force, fraud, and coercion, and you wonder, why didn't this person just leave? Why didn't they just say no? There's been an entire process leading up to that has prevented them from just, okay, I'm just gonna leave. I'm just gonna say no. I don't like this anymore. And then the fifth one, escaping accountability, that basically just means that once they've gotten them where they want them, they continue to use them. They continue to exploit them. They continue to break the law. And the longer that number 5 is continuing to happen, the more into the cycle that we're getting. This isn't just a one-time thing. This is something that's reoccurring over a very long period of time. And it's something that can't just be fixed by saying no. Now, when I first started focusing on human trafficking, my background, I was a sex crimes prosecutor. I've been a domestic violence prosecutor. I've done general felony, juvenile prosecution. I've pretty much done everything except for homicides. And I think that especially in the DV context, we talk a lot about power and control to describe the dynamic in domestic violence relationships. And one thing that I was extremely interested to see was that there is a power and control wheel, the same way that they've done for domestic violence, but it's specific to sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And this power and control wheel kind of shows you all of the ways that this person is using power and control to keep somebody exploited, to keep them in the life. And it's almost identical to the domestic violence one. And when you couple kind of the idea of all of these things going into it, and we start talking about the trauma to the victim, the ability to advocate for them, to even recognize them, to connect with them, it's all of these things that I think make it extremely difficult. I think as a society, we've gotten a lot further in identifying, victims of domestic violence, right? They have kids together, they live in a house together, they're married, they're in a partnership relationship. Those are easy signs to see, and then you add violence. But when we're talking about human trafficking, it's so much more. There's so much more of a web that is wound around them. They could be boyfriend and girlfriend. It could be their parents. It could be somebody who's in a familial relationship with them, but it could also just be somebody that they met off the internet that people in their lives don't even really know about because it's secretive. So actually getting in there and finding victims is extremely, extremely difficult. And then knowing why they stay or what makes it impossible for them to stay, I think just adds perspective to what we as advocates for them need to do once they are ready to talk. And part of the reason why, when we are thinking about the questions that we're asking them, when we are thinking about how many times we're going to be asking them these questions, being a lot more considerate of that. So the next thing I want to talk about is finding evidence to show trafficking. And there are, I would call them common obstacles to actually figuring out. So the first time somebody comes to you and says, hey, I'm a victim of human trafficking, or I think that I'm a victim, or, I possibly was trafficked, but I'm not really sure. The first time that you kind of sit down with somebody, some of the common obstacles are that they lack a timeline. They can't tell you too many details of even exactly when it started, what happened when. And my personal opinion is, because of how HT happens over time, and because it becomes that sort of gradual, like, blurred line, it's like, oh, okay, I can remember when I met this person, but I can't necessarily remember the first time that I was actually trafficked, because everything was fine until this point. And actually finding those moments. Drug abuse is a big thing. So, maybe they weren't on drugs before they met this person, or maybe they were and they exploited that vulnerability. But because of that, they're not good record keepers. They're not good timekeepers. I always say time is a social construct for me, because I have a hard time knowing when things are. And I work a Monday through Friday job, and my life is 24 hours at a day. When we're working with victims of trafficking, they often work 24-hour periods at a time. They sleep whenever they can. They sleep when they don't have customers or clients. And I mean, it's the same for labor trafficking. When it's time for them to work, it's time for them to work. They don't get a choice in that. And because of sort of the constant not sleeping, constant working, even in the moment, I think it's difficult for somebody to give you an accurate depiction of time, let alone in hindsight. And then we also have to talk about how trauma affects the survivor's brain. They've been conditioned, they've been traumatized, they've been in survival mode for such a long period of time that their brain doesn't necessarily have the capacity to share with you the information that you need in order to help them prove that they were trafficked. A lot of the time, law enforcement investigations start with sort of the outcry. Somebody reports, somebody reports, I was a victim of being trafficked. This is my story. And from experience, I can tell you, they sit down and they have that initial conversation. They're just left with a bunch of holes. And that's common. It's normal. They expect that. And it takes a lot of work to go back and start to fill in those holes and fill in those holes and fill in those holes. And oftentimes, even just identifying people that are involved and who they are. Maybe they only know their street name, or they only remember a girl who was working with them by how she looked or what her name in the ads was. It's a lack of information. And I think at times it can be frustrating, because I think we, as normal, fully functioning people without trauma affecting our memory and our day-to-day lives, will think, well, if you were trafficked, you should know more than that, or I should be able to get more information than that, because what you're telling me isn't really helpful. But I think that we have to take a step back and realize, like, the information that they can share with us, it is the best that they can do. And there's, I think, different strategies to deal with that I'll talk about in a second. And it happened long ago. So just because somebody's was in the life doesn't mean that they got out of the life because they got help. Maybe they just made the decision themselves. I've seen people get out of the life because they were sentenced to prison. And in prison, once they were away from their trafficker for a set period of time, they decided they were going to change their life and turn things out and sort of turn over a new leaf. So when they're in the position of, hey, let me talk about this, a lot of time has passed by. So from my viewpoint, or something that I want to kind of point out that I think is maybe overlooked a little bit, is we can find evidence to show trafficking through criminal records. Most survivors who've been in the life have been arrested. Their named trafficker has been arrested. It may be, just a misdemeanor DV charge. It may be a possession of drug charge. It could be something as simple as that, or as complex as, homicide. But when we look at these criminal records, and when you read enough of the police reports, you can gather information that may help your client put together a little bit more information than they were giving you before. So, because, one thing about arrest affidavits is there is a date and a time, there is a location, there is a list of the people that were there, hopefully. And there's also like the background information on either your client or whoever the arrestee was, or potentially the reporter was, that lets you know that, hey, this is where this person was at this point in their life. I think that a lot of times, looking in hindsight to cases where we have allegations now that are being prosecuted, and we can look back and say, oh, well, here's a police report of a DV incident between the trafficker and the victim that took place at this hotel on this date. And it doesn't necessarily have the details of that trafficking that you need, but it creates sort of a context and a time frame. So when you sit down and you have that information and you can talk to your clients about it, you can ask them about it. Hey, do you remember such and such? And often they'll remember big things like arrests. Once you spark that memory, but you have to spark it with something reliable and tangible first. And then you start asking them follow-up questions about that. They can start to give you way more information now that their memory is sort of refreshed. They might be able to tell you, oh yeah, in this time frame, this is exactly what was happening to me. This was before such and such started, or this was after such and such started. And so if you start to take chunks of information like that and put it together, you start to create a timeline, which ultimately tells their story of being trafficked. And sometimes other evidence subject to public record disclosure. So maybe you do have a really good arrest case or something that, maybe it has a lot of information. Maybe your victim is like, oh yeah, I was on scene when law enforcement came and arrested such and such, and I talked to the cops, even though maybe it was something unrelated. Do public records requests, see how much information that you can get from that law enforcement agency. Try and get body worn camera, try and get information. I've had victims tell me that, oh, well, when they were in jail, then, and I have it in my cases now, which I recognize that as a prosecutor, I can get way more information from law enforcement that many of you can, but it's a great starting place. But one of the things is jail calls. I have cases where it was reported in hindsight, and we could go back and see, okay, well, during this 6-month period and this 2-year trafficking period, the trafficker or the secondary trafficker, they were in jail. And we get jail calls, and we can hear the victim on the phone with the trafficker. We can hear, commands being given. We can hear questions. We can hear threats. We can hear how the trafficker is continuing to operate their business, expecting them to put money on their books or to bond them out or to do certain things. We can hear them recruiting other people into this life with them in order to sustain themselves while they're either serving a sentence or incarcerated. And that kind of speaks 1,000, a picture paints 1,000 words. The jail calls, when you can actually hear the conversations during the trafficking period, I think are extremely powerful, because you can hear that dynamic that you can't always see. And because nobody's watching or listening at the time, I think it gives kind of an accurate picture of what's going on. So if you can get your client to remember certain things and remember, like, okay, when they were in jail in such and such time, like, ask them, like, while they were in jail, did you guys talk on the jail calls? Like, what were you doing during the time that they were in jail? And sometimes it's, oh, well, they had, at that time when they were in jail, their brother, such and such, was the person that was collecting my money to make sure that it was on this person's books. It gives you more information. It can give you more things that prove this. And the opposite of it is sometimes your client's the one who was in jail. Sometimes they were in jail for a period of time, and you're now trying to connect the trafficker to them. Like, find who bonded them out. That's a big thing. Traffickers often bond out their moneymakers, and they just have them work it off and pay them back. But their name is now associated officially with that person. So finding evidence through the criminal cases, whether it be your clients, whether it be the trafficker, I think is a very creative way to build chunks of time that often your client isn't going to remember. And they're going to kind of brush over the times that they were arrested or certain things, mostly out of fear or shame, or, just being embarrassed to talk about it, or feeling like, well, you're a lawyer, I don't want to talk to you about something bad that I did. But there's this big concept, I think, kind of sweeping, like sort of next generation human trafficking, of forced criminality. And it's kind of something that I'm going to touch on now, but also talk about relief at the end of the presentation. But forced criminality is the idea that when somebody is being trafficked, so now they're being exploited by this person, they're being forced, coerced, force, fraud, coercion, that, they're committing crimes on behalf of this person. And we're not just talking about, sex trafficking or labor trafficking, but often people that are in those positions are forced to do other things. They're forced to carry drugs, they're forced to sell drugs. One of the things that is popular is the robbing of Johns. So, maybe it's a robbery, sudden snatching, maybe it's a burglary of a dwelling, but there are all these collateral crimes that victims are being forced to do on behalf of the trafficker to further and it just furthers the exploitation. Because once they have them under lock and key, and they've got them to the point where I expect you to do this and this, it's a sort of a collateral effect from there. So forced criminality is the term sort of that goes with that concept, that your client may have been arrested for this or may have been arrested for that, but it's under this umbrella of trafficking. It's not just the crime of sex, it's not just the crime of prostitution or something like that, but it's a full umbrella that says, because of what the trafficker did to them, they didn't have control over the choices that they made, and they were forced to do these other things. So also keep in mind that argument, especially if your client does have a really bad criminal history, sometimes, and it's actually not, it's not rare, but sometimes the person who is being exploited has a worse criminal history than the trafficker. And that's because the trafficker is using the victim to commit all of their crimes. It adds this level of, I don't want to call it innocence, but it adds a barrier between them and law enforcement, the trafficker and law enforcement. And it's really the victim who's getting slammed in between and is getting in trouble for the things that really, really are the trafficker's fault. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about are considerations for when your clients want to report to law enforcement. There is a human trafficking hotline. The number is on the screen, 888-3737-8888. And you're also able to text that number. So if your client isn't in imminent danger, but wants to report their law enforcement, or wants to make a report and have this investigated, the National Human Trafficking Hotline is the best place to do that. If it is an emergency, always call 911. Now, we're in Florida, so there's a bunch of different jurisdictions. But one of the reasons that it's, at least in my opinion, calling the hotline is helpful. And when we get to the law enforcement screen, you'll be able to see, or slide, you'll be able to see that a little bit better. But it's to make sure that the report gets to the correct investigative agency. So throughout Florida, it's inconsistent. It doesn't just go to the jurisdiction, so say that it happened on iDrive in Orlando, and you would think, okay, my client needs to report this to the Orlando Police Department. So they could make that report to the Orlando Police Department, but that's not actually the correct investigative agency, because for that area, it goes to a task force. So sometimes what happens is, if you make the report directly to law enforcement, your client may end up giving statements to the police before they ever meet with the investigative agent. And we just try to avoid that. So if you call the hotline, you'll be able to get it to the agency that you need to report and minimize the need for having multiple interviews.
And I'm sorry, I'm not sure if you explained this. I just saw in the chat, somebody asked, is there an error to the 888 call number? Did you differ? Is there originally just an 888, like a smaller number or that you're aware of, or?
So I'm not sure that I understand, but I think Michelle raised her hand.
Oh, okay.
So
Well,
she asked.
okay. Well, Vilma, if you mind just rephrasing your question in the chat, that would be helpful. And Michelle, if let me chat with Michelle offline because we don't have the ability to unmute people. Let me see if I can get that question for you.
And I will say it's 888-3737-888. So it's broken up differently than the traditional number. Maybe that was the point. But that's only because of the non-consecutive numbers. So it's 888. It starts with 888, it ends with 888, but it's 3737 in the middle.
Got it.
So that
Okay.
might be what it is, because it looks different than like the normal 334.
Yeah, that must be what it is. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So, and now going towards the actual process. And I think this is sometimes where there is a disconnect between, what we do as prosecutors and what attorneys who represent clients aren't always aware of exactly. I don't want to say what your client would be getting into by reporting it to law enforcement, but I think one of the biggest things is to set expectations, and make sure that your clients know exactly what it is. So at the point that so really the initial step is they report the crime, and then it goes to the investigation, and then hopefully, which it doesn't always, but hopefully that leads to an arrest, and then the prosecution is started. So each of those steps can take a really long time. Law enforcement investigations are not open and shut, especially when we're talking about, like when somebody is not in imminent danger, because of the seriousness of human trafficking, because of the ability of the trafficker to, not the ability of the trafficker, but our want to reduce the need for the victim to be in court for the trafficker. The investigation is kind of very, very thorough, and it's not uncommon for investigations to take years. It includes not just interviewing the victim, but it includes subpoenaing records, going back and trying to get, historical reviews. So the same way I'm telling you, hey, look back at these criminal histories, law enforcement's going to do the same thing. And they're going to have access to this large volume of information. And it's kind of like looking for a needle in a haystack, because really what they're doing is trying to find anything that could be helpful in supporting the prosecution of this case, and any fact that there is, they don't want to overlook it. So often the investigations can take a very long time. And so by the time we get to an arrest, the law enforcement would then make an arrest, or put out an arrest warrant generally on investigations that took a really long time. And until that person is in custody, the prosecution of that case doesn't really start. And, if that person is still local, still around, it's pretty easy to get them in custody, but that's not a given. So there are often times where, somebody's sitting in capias for a year or years because law enforcement hasn't been able to find them. Maybe they've left the country, and, just the resources to track people out of the country are limited on some level. If somebody does make contact with law enforcement, we do extradite, but it's hit or miss. I've had defendants who an arrest warrant was out and they were in jail within 12 hours of it being issued. And I've had other people who it's been 12 months and they're still at large, and the prosecution of the case is kind of just sitting there. And it's extremely frustrating to victims who think, okay, we've gotten through the investigation. We know this case is going to be prosecuted. I'm ready to go. But now we have this huge stall. And there's nothing in our power that we can do to sort of overcome that. But it is something that is frustrating. And then eventually we get to the prosecution. So sort of in the human trafficking realm is often different than some of the other charges that we do. Usually by the time we get to prosecution, there is an idea that the case is going to be prosecuted. It's not, I work with law enforcement usually directly. If they are going to be seeking an arrest warrant, generally I have a heads up about it. But I would say most cases, if they're getting an arrest warrant, are going to be prosecuted. But that's only the beginning, is making that decision. So from the actual like filing of charges to trial, it depends. It's 2024 and I have cases right now that are still from 2020. But I also have cases that are from 2023 that have already resolved before this year. So, I mean, it could be anywhere from months if they don't want to waive speedy trial, or it can be up to years if they want to exhaust litigation and do all of anything that they can to sort of, delay the process. It's completely possible. That is within our control somewhat, but even though there are victims' rights, it's still not a perfect system. And when we're talking about, the defendant's right to a fair trial, that's always going to come before a victim's rights in the criminal court system. And it's not fair, and it's not something that I often have to talk to victims about that and let them know, like, because they say it's not fair, and I have to completely acknowledge that, like, the criminal court system isn't a fair system towards victims. However, it's the only way that we have to hold offenders criminally accountable. So if they want their trafficker to go to prison, this is just what we have to do. And so, as I mentioned before, each jurisdiction assigns investigations differently. And so human trafficking is a state crime, and it's also a federal crime, which adds to the complications. So it could be your local, state, county, city agency who's going to do the investigation. It could be a local HT task force. It could be a federal agency, or it can be any combination thereof. I have prosecuted cases that, my local agency has then partnered up with the feds because they were considering federally indicting this person for human trafficking or related crime. And so they have then worked together on the investigation, and somehow it ends up with me. So it really just depends. And just to kind of add a specific, like, I do cases in Orange County and Osceola County. So in Orange County, all of our law enforcement agencies, they send their actual human trafficking investigations to the Metropolitan Bureau of Investigation, which is a specialized human trafficking task force set up of agents who come from all of the agencies, are basically assigned to that task force to investigate these crimes. I also handle cases in Osceola County where some of them are forwarded to the Metropolitan Bureau of Investigation, but like the Osceola Sheriff's Office does their own investigations. They are not a part of the Metropolitan Bureau of Investigation. So I deal with that local agency in the prosecution of their cases. And it becomes, it's confusing for me, and I have to do it all the time. So I know it's confusing for victims, or confusing for attorneys who are trying to figure out really what is the best place to report this crime. Often what happens is it comes in multiple jurisdictions. So if your client was trafficked, Miami, Orlando, Jacksonville, we're not talking about one state attorney's office, one local agency, one anything. And it really does become complicated. And one thing that I've noticed is where it ends up being prosecuted, usually it is not known at the time the investigation starts, but usually by the time they've worked through the facts and they've worked through the evidence and seeing the strength of the case, where it can be, like, what actually can be proven. Sometimes you have a really strong case in Miami. You have the evidence to support it. You have all of these things for that jurisdiction. But maybe what happened in Orlando was only 1 or 2 days and the evidence is weak. So maybe they would forego pursuing anything in Orlando and focus more so on the Miami case, or vice versa. And it's not just law enforcement who has who really kind of mixes the pot and can end up in different places. So the state attorney's office, which is where I work, the U.S. Attorney's Office, which is the federal side of it, and the Office of Statewide Prosecution, who handles the state level charges, but for multiple jurisdictions. All of those agencies have prosecutors who handle human trafficking cases. So it is possible that your client, in the investigation may say, this is what comes out of the investigation, and then the investigator kind of, I don't want to call it shops it to maybe a federal partner at the U.S. Attorney's Office and sees that they can get a prosecutor who wants to prosecute it there, or the Office of the Statewide Prosecutor, they can get a prosecutor there who wants to take the case. But that's definitely what happens. If law enforcement just kind of makes an arrest and sends it through without a prosecutor agreeing to it, it's going to come to the state attorney's office. So I don't have necessarily the luxury of picking which cases I get. Any arrest that is made that isn't already taken by the statewide office is going to come here. So one of the reasons that the investigators, it's important to work with them in the investigative stage is because we really don't know where the case is going to end up. And there's different factors that go into where is the best place for the case to be prosecuted. There's pros and cons to kind of each one, but really it's very fact specific, and it's going to come down to whatever investigator is assigned to your case, really, and what their feelings are and what work they do about where it ends up. All of the offices have dedicated victim advocates. So that's extremely, I think, an extremely helpful thing. So it's not really any detriment to the victim where it ends up, but the level of participation can vary amongst all agencies. So for instance, if they do an arrest warrant, I can file an information and charge this person with human trafficking. It can be punishable by life, whatever. All I have to do is swear that I have this information and file it with the courts. The U.S. Attorney's Office, though, is required to indict. So if your client is going the federal route, they would have to testify at a grand jury. And sometimes it sort of depends. So if your client is already gone through sort of all of the stages appealing and they're in a good place and they're able to testify at a grand jury, that's fantastic. They can get the indictment fresh off, and that's how they would be able to start their case. Statewide, they file information just like us, and indictments aren't required. But so on the state side, we do have depositions. So potentially the victim would have to be deposed by the defense attorney in our cases. But on the federal side, they do not have victim depositions. So there's sort of a trade-off. The victim will have to participate to some level, but just kind of the timing and things of that nature, it depends where things end up. All right, so other considerations for when your client wants to report to law enforcement. I hope that I have done a sufficient job of sort of explaining the process. I think a lot of it is, we don't know exactly what it's going to be, but that there are processes in place, and there are places where the case is going to be investigated, and it is a process. And so I think that is a theme that really needs to be, sort of communicated to survivors who are wanting to prepare their case or report their case, is that it is a process. Everything doesn't happen on a great timeline. So setting expectations and letting them know that, these are the people who you will be involved in. It may take a really long time, but this is the only way we can get that outcome. So be patient, be participatory, but also continue to work on yourselves. I think it's important that, people are doing the work to, not just therapy, but getting their lives in order, getting, their family law paperwork in order, immigration, like all of those things, their credit cleared up, all of the things that let their lives move on so they can continue to be survivors rather than sitting and waiting on the criminal process. The greatest success I've had from survivors being able to come into court and testify are the ones who have built their lives, who have done the work, who aren't just sitting there waiting and waiting and waiting, but who are moving on and continuing to live their lives and kind of just check in. Because the pace that the case moves at here is out of their control. But the pace that they live their life is within their control. So it's always going back to that idea of focus on what you can. It is a process. Lower your expectations. And then as their legal representatives, you can also always make sure that, before they are doing these interviews or anything involving the reporting of it, make sure that they have a victim advocate, or if they're minors, they have a guardian ad litem. Because I think it is important that they have somebody in the room who is tuned into their needs, who is going to be able to build that relationship with them over time, explain things to them in a way. As much as I talk about a victim-centered, trauma-informed approach, not every law enforcement officer, asks questions the same way that I do. Not every prosecutor does. Not everybody who they're going to be talking to in the process is going to have the same level of training or advocacy as, kind of what we're talking about today. So victim advocates have been, I think, a godsend in this field. I've worked with them in different areas as a prosecutor, but like having my victim advocate, like specifically specializing in human trafficking victims and understanding kind of their hurdles and their life is hard in specific ways and things that they can do to help them, I think is something that you want to make sure that your client has. And they are available. So that's why just make sure that they're there. So we're running low on time, so I'll just speed this up a little bit. But so considerations from when your client does not want to report to law enforcement, possibly yet or ever, preserve evidence. So maybe you have gone to some lengths, maybe they have text messages, phone calls, photos, witnesses, people that they know that are there. Preserve the evidence. Everything that they remember now, they may not remember at the time that they're going to report it. So preserving what you have without feeling the need to, like, they don't have to turn it over. However, if they do change their mind later, they're going to want to make sure that they have it. So I always say preserve what evidence you have. And even if they continue to gather evidence, over the years as they come into it or remember, keep a journal, write things down. That can be a useful tool for when they are ready to disclose or make that report. Another important thing is consider the statute of limitations. So for human trafficking itself, there is not a statute of limitations, but one thing that we know is that there are other collateral crimes that come with human trafficking, like unlawful sexual activity with a minor. So say their trafficking happened when they were 16 or 17-year-old and their trafficker was having sex with them. That has a 3-year statute of limitations. There's other things like deriving proceeds from prostitution that has a statute of limitations. So there are other charges sometimes that are associated with it that do have a statute of limitations. So knowing that if they don't report it now, that's okay. The human trafficking at this time doesn't have one, but just also understanding, maybe if there is another serious crime attached to it, maybe examining exactly what that statute of limitations would be, and informing them so that way they know what their deadline is and they can decide at that point if, they really are in a place where they do want to move forward with charges. And that resources and help are still available. So just because they don't want to report it to law enforcement, that's perfectly okay. There are a lot of nonprofits in this field. There are a lot of resources for survivors. There are, residential programs. There are, mentors. There are therapy. There are so many resources available, and not one of them is, sort of predicated on the idea that they have to report it to law enforcement in order to get any of these resources. And in fact, what I have found is it's usually the people who have actually engaged with the resources available that finally get to the point where they're like, I actually am ready to hold my trafficker accountable, and I do want to report this to law enforcement. So definitely still encourage them to utilize the resources, even if they feel like they don't want to report it to law enforcement. It's a completely separate thing. One more area that comes up, and this goes back to sort of the forced criminality sort of aspect of it, are considerations for when your client is or was being prosecuted. So it can happen in several different ways. What we see are, people being prosecuted in related cases. And when I say related cases, I mean they're charged as co-defendants. So they were trafficked by their trafficker. They were potentially the bottom, meaning they were sort of, given some level of power over girls or boys underneath them, but they're still being victimized. But they are now accountable in the criminal, sort of the criminal spectrum of liability. So they've been charged as a co-defendant. So I would consider that a related case. And a lot of the times what happens in those cases is you have to make sure that the prosecutor can identify them as a victim. But they also have to be willing to self-identify as a victim, which can be an obstacle if they don't know that they're a victim. Oftentimes what I do for people in that situation is I send them to programs, residential treatment programs. They're basically willingness to prosecute or participate in the prosecution of the main trafficker will, generally speaking, help them to the point that like they're not going to be spending the rest of their life in prison. But that varies by prosecutor, it varies by situation. Sometimes there's cases where somebody was clearly a victim at one point and they've now fully crossed over and they are now victimizing other people. They're doing what was done to them, and they, there's some level of accountability that they have to have when we're talking about those situations. Now, for unrelated cases, whether they're a victim of trafficking, it can be, so if it's unrelated to any human trafficking case and unrelated to their victimization, potentially that's still something that you can do for mitigation. So if your client, has a drug problem and is continuing to pick up drugs, but wants to participate in a program that's human trafficking specific, because that's what's really going to get to the root cause of the trauma and all of the issues, that is something that could potentially be shown to the prosecutor to get a better sentence. And I would call that mitigation. But sometimes when we're talking about forced criminality, it might be a case where, it's not human trafficking related, but they did it because their trafficker made them to, or made them do it. And, potentially you have a duress defense. There's a lot of factors that go into that. But that's also information that often the prosecutor doesn't have, but needs. They need to know that, this person was forced to it. We're limited to really the reports of law enforcement. And unless we know something outside the scope of that, and just because maybe in my office, I have worked with this person and I know their story and then they're arrested, often I wouldn't know that they were arrested. I would know their whole story and, all of the reasons why I felt like, maybe a mental health treatment program would be good for them. But the person actually prosecuting may not have that information. So that's important. The resources and help are still available, even when somebody is charged with a crime, or, in jail, out of jail, human trafficking related or not. The nonprofits are still more than willing to work with anybody who has been a victim of human trafficking, as long as they meet their qualifications. And they don't hold it against them that they have a criminal history. So another thing that's unique in Florida are expungements. So if your client was being trafficked over a period of time, so say, they were trafficked for 10 years, and in that time they committed crimes, sort of this idea of forced criminality, but even looser when we're talking about expungements. There is a statute in Florida that allows for them to petition for the expungement of all of their crimes. And so that is a really powerful tool for people who have, been victims, have been in the life, have a terrible criminal history, but have turned their lives around. They're no longer in the life. They want to have good jobs. They want to have housing. They don't want all these felonies on their record from when they were victimized. The expungement statute in Florida I think it's pretty broad, and I think it's pretty powerful for victims and survivors to be able to turn over sort of a new leaf and get that criminal history expunged. All right, so that is mainly what I wanted to talk about. I think I don't know if we have a few minutes for question and answers, or if there were any in the chat, but now would be a great time.
Always time for questions and answers. I don't see any that came in through the chat except the one that I brought up earlier, or through the Q&A. But folks, while I'm taking up some airtime, please feel free to drop in your questions if you have any last minute burning thoughts. The first thing I want to say is, Ryan, thank you so much. It really does give a lot of clarity to those in the legal aid world, what exactly is going on, on the other side and I think what you said at the end, a few slides back, I think it was slide 14, is really poignant, right? Like, we're talking about power and control. We're talking about people who have not felt their own power, maybe never, if not in a very long time. And then they go through the criminal justice system and there's powerlessness there too. Like you said, it's not really on their time. It's on the court's time. It's on the evidentiary time. And so us in the legal aid world, I thought that was really empowering, that we have this unique position to help survivors with all these other not ancillary, but collateral matters to make the person feel like they're slowly gaining their power back where they can. And I thought that was really, really awesome. And I really appreciate you reminding us of that.
Yes, definitely. I think it's a great place to be in, because nobody likes their life being on hold, especially when they're ready to start over and start their new life.
Absolutely. So for folks, I did pop the CLE code into the chat. That code is 24007N. I'm sorry, 793N as in Nancy. You'll get that code along with a copy of the recording. So don't worry if you don't jot it down here. You're going to receive an email from Zoom, not from my direct email, but from Zoom with the information that you are looking for. So something did come into the chat. It's a comment, but worth reading. This person said, also fantastic reminders for being mindful of how we talk to clients and who have experienced any kind of trauma. Great training. Thank you so much. And I agree, Carrie. I was thinking about that in the beginning. I struggle with it, right? I'm on a platform here with 45 people in an audience. Thank God I've never, I'm not a survivor of trauma or trafficking, and I don't ever want to offend anyone. I want to do the right thing, and you never know what to do. So those reminders that you gave us of how to be communicative and be mindful, and really just talking about the mirroring, I think that is really, really helpful. So I agree. Thank you for that as well, Ryan. And then another question came in. Can we have the recording of this webinar? Yes, don't worry. The recording will be sent to everybody who's here and everybody who registered. That will come in the form of an email from Zoom, but I did pop my email address into the chat a little bit earlier. Something's up with me. I put it was Gmail, then I had to delete the comment. Something's up with me today. I don't know. It's a Monday. But I did pop my email address into the chat for anybody who doesn't get that email or needs anything from me. So with that being said, Ryan, lots of folks are saying thank you into the chat. Also, sorry, last reminder, in the chat, I did put the link to our second and final part of this series. It's going to be tomorrow at noon. Again, we're talking about what legal aid lawyers need to know to effectively represent their human trafficking survivor clients. So same thing, it'll be recorded, but we would love you to be there in person. Registration's in the chat. Don't miss out. And Ryan, I see you put your email in the chat. Is that something you'd like me to share with everyone?
Yes, I put my email in there. If anyone has any questions, anything specific, I know that sometimes it can be overwhelming to try and navigate the system. If you have a victim who really does want to report, I don't mind offering any insight, even if it's not my jurisdiction. I know how things work here in the Orlando area, but I don't mind helping you, putting you in contact with anybody that I think can help. Also resources. You may not know resources, but I work with victim advocates who have a ton. I work with nonprofits around who are always looking for people to serve. So if you ever have anything in the human trafficking prosecution realm, feel free to reach out to me. I'd be more than happy to do what I can to help.
That's incredible. Thank you so much. A line of resource is completely just, invaluable. So folks,
Yeah.
jot it down. I'll also include it in the recording, in the email with the copy of the recording and the CLE code. So, the last thing I'm going to leave this on, and I usually say this in the beginning, I was a little flustered in the beginning. I don't know if I told everyone, but my dog escaped from the backyard minutes before we started. I had to chase my dog, so I'm better now. But, we had this training series because January marks Human Trafficking Awareness Month. But I say this every time. Just because we are talking about this in this month doesn't mean it's not a conversation for the next month, for the year, for the next year. This is, these awareness months let us sit and sort of have these pauses and really focus. But I just encourage everyone to not lose that desire to continue to educate yourself, about this important subject. And, it's not just 1 month, it's a lifetime of representing and promoting and protecting survivors in this way. So Ryan, thank you so much. We'll let you go. I'm sure you have to run into court or have a pre-file happening or something like that. So thank you very much for everything that you do. And it was such a pleasure to work with you on this. And I hope to work with you again in the future on educating our legal aid community.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Bye, everybody. Happy Monday. It definitely feels like a Monday on my end. See you all tomorrow. Bye.